Hi all, it's Teresa in Gemma's house. Well, this week I'm going to start sewing my new patchwork quilt. And I hope you saw my previous video of when I was preparing this patchwork quilt. I had to first decide on the size of the quilt and the size of the squares and how many squares I needed for the quilt. And if you haven't seen that video, I'll post it to the end of this video in case you want to watch that too. Well, this week I am finished cutting the squares and I needed 1,936 squares, 2-inch finish size. So I cut them at 2.5 inches. And I cut a few extra. I have 1,990 squares, so I have a nice variety to choose from. And I dumped them all into this plastic bag and tried to shake them up as much as I could to mix them up. A lot of them are sticking together, but I think I'll still be able to choose a nice variety as I'm stitching these together. And I'm going to start sewing 11 squares in a strip. So I'll keep sewing those strips of 11 squares, and then I'll sew 11 strips together to make 22 by 22 inch blocks. And I think that will be easier to manage on the machine. And then I'll start sewing those larger blocks together to get to the finished size of my quilt. So this is going to be interesting. This is a new type of quilt for me. And even though I've made other quilts that have patchwork elements in them, they were more of a structured type of pattern where I decided on the squares that would go where, and this is going to be a lot more random. So, time to start sewing. Okay, so like I mentioned before, I'm going to sew 11 squares together in each row. And then I'll sew 11 rows together, and that will give me a larger block that measures 22 inches by 22 inches, 11 squares across and 11 squares down. So I'm starting out by sewing all of these squares for the first strip individually. And as you can see, this is a lot of wasted thread. And it's taking a long time to get this first strip sewn together. So I'm such a practical person that this is not going to work for me. So I'm going to use a method that is called chain piecing. And I do this by taking the first 2 squares of the first row and sewing them. Then I take 2 more squares for the second row, and without moving the needle out of the fabric or taking any other stitches, I just continue and sew those 2 squares together, take 2 squares for the third row, and again, without moving the needle or taking any additional stitches in between the rows, I just continue sewing with the one continuous thread all of these squares for each row. And I sew 11 rows of these 2 squares. It's important not to take any additional stitches in between these rows. You want to keep these rows tight, because when you start sewing the rows together, the rows will be nicely lined up and the seams between the squares will line up with each other really nicely. So that's important. Don't take any additional stitches in between these rows. So you can see right away that the advantage to this is that you're not cutting off 5 or 6 inches of thread in between each row of squares. When I get to the bottom, I just go to the top, open up those first 2 squares, and choose the next square. And just continue sewing a third square onto each row. Again, not taking any additional stitches in between the rows of squares, as I just sew with one continuous thread all the way down 11 rows of squares. So you can choose squares if you don't want this to be totally random. You can choose squares based on the squares that are in the row above and below. I try not to have two squares of the same pattern right beside each other. It's okay if they're like diagonally across from each other, or maybe using the same square with a different square in between them. I think that's okay because that still looks pretty random. So this is kind of like a controlled random placement of the squares. And I really do like this method because, of course, it's really saving on thread, and it takes way less time, I find, too. Okay, so now that I have all 11 rows sewed together, I'm going to iron these seams flat. And I'm going to use this technique called nesting the seams, where the seams in between the squares for one row will lay in a different direction from the seams between the squares in the next row, so that they're not on top of each other when you sew the rows together. That would make the seams too thick then when you sew the rows together. So this nesting the seams technique will ensure that the piece lays much flatter and those seams won't be too thick then. But this ironing technique that I'm doing is pretty difficult and time consuming, I have to say. So I'm trying a different method here. I'm trying to iron the seams for the first row towards one direction, and then I'm folding the fabric so that the next row is on the top, and I'm ironing those seams towards the opposite direction. So I'm trying this method, and it seems to be a little easier than that first method that I tried. You can try whatever way you can to do this. And if you have any ideas how to do this easier, please leave a comment and let me know. So as I'm sewing these rows together, I'm finding that the seams line up pretty well. And as I get to the intersection of each of the squares, I'm trying my best to line the squares' seams up together, making sure that the seam allowances are laying in different directions. Okay, so once I have all of the 11 rows sewed together, when I iron it now, I can iron all of those seams between the rows in the same direction. This is a 22 by 22 inch block, and I'm going to have 16 of these for my finished quilt. So when I sew these 22 by 22 inch blocks together, I'll just make sure to position each one so that these seams between these rows nest with the seams in the block that I sew it to. So as you can see, the seam allowances for each individual row are laying in opposite directions. And then the seams between the rows for this entire 22 by 22 inch block, they're all laying in the same direction. And they will nest with the block that I sew it to. Those seams between the rows will be laying in the opposite direction. That's one of the advantages of making large blocks like this, and then sewing those blocks together to make the entire quilt. Okay, so that ironing was pretty difficult and it got really annoying. So after a few blocks, when I sewed a new block together, I decided to try a different method. I didn't iron this block after I had sewn all of the squares in the individual rows. So as I'm sewing the rows together now, I'm having to put a little more effort into making sure these seams are nested, one seam facing one direction and the other seam facing the other direction. And I had to stay focused, but I wanted to try it because that ironing was really difficult and it took a lot of time. So as I folded each of these rows together, right sides together of course, I had to take note of which direction the seams between the squares were laying. And I had to keep that in mind as I sewed the rows together. As I had more and more rows sewed together, I gave the whole block a good shake when I was folding the rows together to make sure they were laying flat and nothing was bunching up. After I had all 11 rows sewed together, I ironed the seams of the first row in the direction that they were supposed to lay. Then holding the fabric of the bottom of the block tight and keeping the block as taut as possible, I ironed the seams of all of the rows into one direction. And I found it easy for some reason to kind of wiggle the iron as I went over all of these rows. So I wanted to try different methods of ironing these seams flat and see which one I preferred. And I think I like this method the best of ironing the seams flat after I have sewn all of the squares together into rows and then sewed all of the rows together, nesting all of the seams, and then iron everything flat after that. But I wanted to show you all of the methods and you can decide which one that you would like to use. And then the best part of this is when you get to flip the block over and iron it on the top. I always find that there are a lot of stray threads that I pull out as I'm ironing the block flat. And I do stretch the block a little to make sure these seams are laying as flat as possible at this point. When you start sewing the blocks together, I will have 4 blocks in each row and then I'll have 4 rows of blocks. So it's a good idea to still have the seams nesting with each other. And it's up to you the placement that you want to do, as long as the seams between the squares from one block nest with the seams between the squares in the next block over. And then of course when you start joining rows, those seams between the rows of one block ideally should nest with the seams between the rows of the block that you're sewing it to. Again, the placement of these is up to you, as long as you can get it to work, ideally so all of the seams are nesting with each other, so the seams don't become too thick. And then this whole piece will lay much flatter, which is ideally the way you want the quilt tops to turn out, that they lay nice and flat and they're not rippling or bunching up too thick at the seams. Okay, so my last step before I start putting the borders on is to iron the whole quilt of all 1,936 squares. And I do stretch the top a little to make sure all of these seams are opened out all the way, and I iron everything as flat as I can, especially these last couple seams where I joined the last couple blocks and then the last couple rows to each other. And of course, this is a good time to admire your work and give yourself a pat on the back for persevering with this type of project. And the next step I'm going to do is to add some borders to get to the measurement for the finished quilt, which is 96 by 96. I'm going to cut strips out of this beautiful batik fabric. These are fat quarters that I had bought a while ago, on sale of course. And if you're not familiar with the term, a fat quarter is 1/4 of a yard of fabric cut to 18 by 22 inches. So I'll cut 1.5-inch strips out of this beautiful batik, and then that will give me a 1-inch thin border right around the perimeter of all the squares. And then I bought this beautiful cotton fabric for the final border. I'll make the final border about 4 or 5 inches, and that will go around all 4 sides of the quilt. And just like that, the quilt top is finished. I didn't quilt this yet because just stitching all of this together was plenty of work for the last 2 weeks. So look for my video in the next couple weeks of how I quilt this to finish up this quilt so I can use it. So I am really happy with how colorful it is because I really do love color. And as I look at this quilt, I can see all of my familiar fabrics that I really loved, some from other quilt projects, and others I had just bought because I loved the prints on them. I ended up running out of the black print fabric for the final border, so I just added a few inches of a black printed fabric in the middle of 2 of the sides, and I don't think you'll ever notice that. I'm really happy with these last 2 borders because I think it finishes up the quilt really nicely, and it puts a nice twist on an otherwise pretty traditional looking quilt. And I just love these prints and the colors. So I hope you got some good tips that you can use from watching this video. And whether you're just starting to quilt or whether you're a more experienced quilter, it would really be helpful if you have suggestions to leave them in the comments so we can all learn from each other. I think that's really helpful. And can I also ask you to check out my main Gemma's House channel page, because you might see some other videos that you're interested in watching as well. And if you like this video, can I please ask you to give it a thumbs up? That really helps my channel to grow. So thanks a lot for watching. Bye-bye.